Welcome back to another deep dive into the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war. Tonight, we're exploring two of the most savage and tragic Space Marine legions ever to stride across the battlefields of the galaxy. Two legions painted in crimson. Two legions defined by rage. Two legions that walked parallel paths, yet arrived at destinations as different as heaven and hell. We're talking about the World Eaters and the Blood Angels, brothers in blood, divided by honor. Before we descend into this tale of fury and nobility, if you enjoy these explorations of Warhammer's deepest lore, hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell really helps the channel grow. It lets me know you want more content like this, and honestly, it means the world. Now, settle in as we unravel the stories of Angron's damned berserkers and Sanguinius's cursed angels. This is going to be a journey through some of the darkest corners of the Imperium's history. So let's begin. Angels and demons in red. In the sprawling mythology of Warhammer 40,000, few comparisons are as stark or as compelling as that between the World Eaters and the Blood Angels. On the surface, these two legions share so much. Both are renowned for their ferocity in close combat. Both are defined by an uncontrollable rage that turns them into engines of destruction on the battlefield. Both wear armor painted in shades of red and white, their heraldry speaking to blood spilled and violence unleashed. Both were created as shock assault troops, designed to be hurled at the enemy's strongest positions and break through where other forces would falter. Yet despite these similarities, the World Eaters and Blood Angels represent opposite ends of a spectrum that defines what it means to be transhuman warriors in service to humanity. One legion surrendered completely to their rage, becoming mindless butchers who worship at the altar of the blood god Khorne. The other has fought for 10,000 years to master their curse, channeling their fury into disciplined service while maintaining the nobility and honor that defines them. One fell to chaos during the Horus Heresy and has spent millennia as scattered warbands of traitors. The other remained loyal to the Emperor and stands even now as one of the Imperium's most revered chapters. The question that haunts anyone who studies these two legions is simple yet profound. What made the difference? Both were afflicted with curses that drove them toward bloodlust and madness. Both lost brothers to the red haze of uncontrolled violence. Both knew the intoxicating rush of battle fury that made them nearly unstoppable in combat. So why did one fall while the other endured? The answer lies not in the nature of their curses, but in how they chose to face them. It lies in leadership, in culture, in the fundamental choices made by their primarchs and carried forward by their warriors across the millennia. To understand this divergence, we need to go back to the beginning, back to before they were the World Eaters and the Blood Angels, back to when they were the 12th and 9th Legions, warriors being forged in the crucible of Terra's unification wars, before they were reunited with the Gene Fathers, who would shape their destinies forever. The 12th Legion, originally known as the Warhounds, were already known for their ferocity and their willingness to accept casualties that other legions would consider unacceptable. They were the Emperor's hammer, meant to be thrown at problems with overwhelming force. There was nothing subtle about the Warhounds. They excelled at frontal assaults, at closing with the enemy and grinding them down through sheer, relentless aggression. Even before Angron's discovery, they had a reputation as a legion that would get the job done no matter the cost. though this came with a dark reputation for brutality. The 9th Legion, called the Revenant Legion in those early days, had a different but equally grim role. They were deployed to the most hellish war zones of Terra, to regions so contaminated by the weapons of Old Night that only the specially adapted could survive. They fought in rad wastes and chem zones, places where reality itself seemed poisoned. Unlike other legions that recruited from the nobility or warrior classes of conquered nations, the Revenant Legion took in the dispossessed, the broken, the survivors of humanity's worst horrors, and they made of them warriors who were both terrible and necessary. Both legions existed in a kind of twilight, acknowledged as essential but never celebrated. They did the work that needed doing, the bloody and thankless tasks that secured the Emperor's vision for a unified Terra. But they also carried shadows with them, whispers of practices that made even hardened Imperial commanders uncomfortable. The 9th Legion's habit of consuming the flesh and blood of fallen champions earned them the nickname Eaters of the Dead. The 12th Legion's tendency to sustain massive casualties while inflicting even more massive destruction made them simultaneously valuable and concerning. These were the raw materials from which 2 of the Imperium's most famous legions would be forged. Warriors already touched by darkness, already comfortable with brutality, already walking a knife's edge between controlled violence and savage excess. All they needed were their Primarchs to push them fully in one direction or another. And when those Primarchs were found, when Angron and Sanguinius were discovered on their respective worlds and reunited with their gene sons, everything changed. The paths that opened before these 2 legions diverged from that moment forward. One would be led by a Primarch who was broken before the Emperor ever found him, a slave warrior who had every reason to hate authority and whose own augmentations drove him toward uncontrolled fury. The other would be led by perhaps the most noble of all the Primarchs, a being of such purity and grace that even his brother Horus sensed he could never match Sanguinius's connection to their father. One legion would be given a name that spoke to their purpose as devourers of worlds. The other would be named for the angelic nature of their Primarch and the hope he represented. This is where our story truly begins. Not in the final battles of the Horus heresy, not in the current age where one legion serves chaos and the other defends the Imperium, but in those crucial moments when 2 similar legions met their destinies and began walking paths that would lead them to completely different fates. The World Eaters, born in blood and chains. To understand the World Eaters, you must first understand Angron. And to understand Angron, you must understand Nuceria, the world where the infant Primarch crashed after the Chaos Gods scattered the Emperor's sons across the galaxy. Nuceria was a world of contradictions, technologically advanced enough to have achieved some level of sophistication, yet morally bankrupt developed in ways that defied comprehension. The planet was ruled by an aristocracy called the High Riders, nobles who lived lives of absolute decadence, while the masses existed to serve their whims. But the worst aspect of Nucerian culture was its gladiatorial tradition. The High Riders had turned brutality into entertainment, creating vast arenas where slaves fought and died for the amusement of crowds. To make their gladiators more effective, more savage, more entertaining, they employed ancient technology from the Dark Age, cybernetic implants called the butcher's nails. These devices were crude by any standard, but devastatingly effective. They were hammered directly into a slave's skull, cables and metal penetrating brain tissue to fundamentally alter how the subject experienced reality. The butcher's nails didn't add anything to a person. They took away. They stripped out the ability to feel peace, contentment, or joy. They turned every sensation into pain, a constant agonizing static that filled every waking moment. The only relief, the only escape from that crushing torment came through violence. When a person with the nails experienced rage, when they gave themselves over to fury and bloodshed, the implants would release a flood of pleasure chemicals. Killing brought respite. Slaughter brought peace. The more savage the violence, the greater the relief. This was the fate that awaited any child born to slavery in Nuceria's gladiatorial pits. And when a Primarch crashed into that world, wounded and alone, the slavers saw only an opportunity. They captured the young Angron and threw him into the brutal world of the arena. At first, they tried numerous augmentations on him, attempting to enhance their prize fighter with crude cybernetics and chemical treatments. Every attempt failed, rebuffed by the Primarch's superhuman physiology. Every attempt except one. The butcher's nails, that ancient and terrible technology, successfully integrated with Angron's brain. We can barely imagine what this did to a being designed to be a leader of humanity, a general capable of planning campaigns across entire sectors of space. The Primarchs were crafted to be not just warriors, but statesmen, philosophers, builders of empire. And Angron had all of that potential shattered by crude archaeotech designed for a completely different purpose. The nails didn't care that he was a Primarch. They did their work anyway, turning a being of godlike potential into a weapon that could only find peace through murder. But even broken, even suffering under the constant torment of the nails, Angron proved himself exceptional. He became a legend in Nuceria's arenas, known as the Lord of the Red Sands. His fame spread across the entire world, and in the process, he formed bonds with his fellow gladiators, slaves like himself who fought and bled together. These bonds were the only genuine relationships Angron would ever truly know, forged in shared suffering and the constant proximity of death. The tragedy of Angron's story reaches its peak with the death of Enemouse. This older gladiator had been something like a father figure to the young Primarch, teaching him, protecting him, forming a connection that gave Angron something to hold on to in the nightmare of his existence. But the High Riders, in their infinite cruelty, decided the two should fight each other to the death. Angron refused, openly defying his masters, so they had the butcher's nails implanted into him as punishment, then forced him to face Enemouse while the nails drove him into berserker fury. Angron tore apart the only father figure he'd ever known, and when the red haze cleared and he realized what he'd done, he howled for days. This moment broke something fundamental in Angron. He swore revenge against all the High Riders, against everyone who had made him into this thing. He organized a slave revolt, rallying thousands of gladiators to break their chains and flee into the mountains. For a time, they fought a guerrilla war against the armies of Nuceria. They won victories against impossible odds. They proved that even slaves with improvised weapons could defeat trained soldiers when they fought with nothing left to lose. Angron became more than a gladiator. He became a symbol of resistance, a leader of the dispossessed. But rebellion can only last so long against overwhelming force. The High Riders committed more and more resources to hunting down Angron and his army. Battles of attrition took their toll. Eventually, only about 1,000 gladiators remained, cornered by 5 full Nucerian armies with no hope of escape. So Angron and his companions did something that spoke to their absolute defiance. They dug their own graves. They prepared to die on their own terms, to sell their lives as dearly as possible in one final battle. They would not surrender. They would not beg. They would die fighting. And the bodies of their enemies would be their memorial. That's when the Emperor arrived. The Master of Mankind had been watching from orbit, observing his lost son and evaluating the situation. And in a decision that would echo through the ages, the Emperor chose to teleport Angron away from the battlefield. He saved his son's life, but condemned him to something arguably worse. Angron was yanked away in the moment before the final battle, forced to watch from orbit as his brothers and sisters were slaughtered to the last warrior. The only family he'd ever truly known died without him, and he would spend the rest of his existence believing he should have died with them. The Emperor gave Angron command of the 12th Legion, the Warhounds, and informed him of his purpose. But Angron never forgave his father for that intervention. He never accepted the role thrust upon him, and in his rage and grief, he made a decision that would doom not just himself, but every warrior under his command. He ordered his apothecaries and tech marines to reverse engineer the butcher's nails, using his own implants as a template. He wanted his legion to share his suffering, to understand what he experienced every moment of every day. Perhaps he thought it would create the kind of brotherhood he'd known with his gladiator companions. Perhaps he simply couldn't bear being alone in his torment. The process was refined enough that legionaries could survive the implantation, though the early attempts had a 100% fatality rate. Karn was the first World Eater to survive, thanks to improvements derived from technology found on the world of Genna. Unlike Angron's dreadlock-like cables that hung from his skull, the Legion's version appeared as finer wires, but the effect was similar. The Butcher's nails robbed the World Eaters of their ability to feel anything but pain. Unless they were engaged in violence, they couldn't sleep. They couldn't find peace. They couldn't enjoy anything except the act of killing. This transformation changed the 12th Legion fundamentally. They abandoned complex tactics and strategies. They threw away their bolters and focused exclusively on chain axes and other melee weapons, tools that would let them close with the enemy and experience the immediate feedback of slaughter. They became uncontrollable in battle, charging forward regardless of losses, unable and unwilling to coordinate with other Imperial forces. The Legion that had once been the Warhounds became the World Eaters, named by Angron for their purpose as devourers of entire civilizations. The Emperor banned the practice of nails implantation after the World Eaters massacred an entire planet's population in a single night on Genna. But Angron ignored the prohibition. By then, the damage was done. Most of the Legion had already been implanted, and new recruits rushed to receive the nails before even completing their transformation into Space Marines, desperate to share in their Primarch's suffering and perhaps finally earn his acknowledgement. Angron himself rarely led his Legion in any meaningful sense. He fought alongside them, certainly, but he provided no real command, no strategic vision. He was a weapon that pointed itself at the enemy and killed until there was nothing left to kill. The Butcher's nails were slowly killing Angron. His Primarch physiology meant he couldn't simply have them removed without catastrophic brain damage or death. But they were degenerative in his case. The Mechanicum predicted he would die before the Great Crusade even ended, his brain slowly consumed by the archaeotech that had been hammered into it decades earlier. He was a Primarch on borrowed time, growing more unstable and less coherent with each passing year. And his Legion followed him faithfully down that path, becoming more savage, more uncontrollable, more divorced from anything resembling the Emperor's original vision for the Space Marine legions. When the Horus Heresy began, when War Master Horus revealed his treachery and called for his brothers to join him in rebellion, Angron needed no convincing. He hated the Emperor. He had always hated the Emperor. The only question was whether following Horus would give him more opportunities to express that hate through violence. The answer was yes. And so the World Eaters became traitors not because they were corrupted by chaos, But because they had already been broken long before the dark gods ever turned their attention to them, they were pre-damaged goods, a legion whose loyalty had never really existed because their Primarch had never really been loyal. During the heresy, the World Eaters distinguished themselves by their complete commitment to slaughter. At Istvan III, they led the assault that purged their own loyalist brothers. At the Siege of Terra, they threw themselves at the Emperor's palace with suicidal fervor, caring nothing for casualties, seeking only to kill and kill and kill until there was nothing left. And after the siege failed and the traitor legions fled to the Eye of Terror, the World Eaters found a new master in Khorne, the blood god who represented everything they had already become. There was no corruption needed. They had been serving Khorne in all but name for decades. Making it official just meant they got demonic gifts in exchange for continuing to do what they were always going to do anyway. This is the tragedy of the World Eaters. They were doomed from the moment Angron crashed onto Nuceria, perhaps with a different Primarch, one who could have led them with honor and discipline. The 12th Legion might have remained loyal, but they got Angron, and Angron gave them the nails, and from that point forward their fate was sealed. They became what they were always going to become: mindless butchers who exist only to spill blood in the name of a god who cares nothing for honor, strategy, or anything beyond the simple metric of skulls taken. The Blood Angels. Nobility shadowed by darkness. The story of the Blood Angels begins in a very different place than that of the World Eaters, yet carries its own darkness, its own tragedy. When the infant Sanguinius was scattered by chaos along with his brothers, he came to rest on Baal Secundus, one of the moons orbiting the desert world of Baal. In ancient times, this system had been prosperous, with Terra-like atmospheres and thriving colonies. But during the Age of Strife, civil war erupted between Baal and its moons, and the conflict escalated to the use of nuclear and chemical weapons. By the time Sanguinius arrived, Baal Secundus was a radioactive hellscape, where survival required radiation suits and constant vigilance against both the environment and the mutants that had proliferated in the aftermath of the devastation. Sanguinius himself was affected by whatever power the Chaos Gods used to scatter the Primarchs, where his brothers arrived on their worlds essentially human in appearance, if oversized and preternaturally gifted. Sanguinius bore a mutation that should have marked him as an abomination. 2 great wings grew from his back, white-feathered and angelic in appearance. In almost any other circumstance, these wings would have meant death. The tribes of Baal Secundus were harsh judges of mutation, having fought for generations against the twisted creatures that had once been human. But when they found the infant Primarch, something about him stayed their hands. Perhaps it was the innocence of a child. Perhaps it was the beauty of those wings, so unlike the deformities they associated with mutation. Perhaps it was simply that something about Sanguinius called to the best parts of humanity, even in people hardened by decades of survival in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Whatever the reason, the tribe called the People of Pure Blood took Sanguinius in and raised him as one of their own. And as he grew with the supernatural speed of all Primarchs, he proved himself exceptional. even beyond his transhuman abilities. Sanguinius used his powers not to dominate, but to unite. He brought the human tribes of Baal Secundus together, organizing them into an effective fighting force, capable of standing against the mutant hordes that threatened to overwhelm them. He personally led combat actions, his wings allowing him to strike from the air, to reach places no other warrior could access, to inspire his followers with the sight of an angel fighting alongside them. He didn't just conquer the mutants through military might. He gave the people of Baal something they'd almost forgotten they could have: hope for a better future. When the Emperor arrived at Baal during his search for the lost Primarchs, Sanguinius recognized him immediately. There was no conflict, no test of wills, no need for the Emperor to prove himself. The Primarch simply looked at his father and knew. He knelt without hesitation, pledging his service and his loyalty. It was one of the smoothest and most harmonious reunions between the Emperor and any of his sons. Sanguinius was everything a Primarch should be: noble, brilliant, powerful, and absolutely devoted to the Emperor's vision for humanity. The Emperor gave Sanguinius command of the 9th Legion, those warriors who had been fighting in Terra's most hellish war zones, who had earned the dark nickname Eaters of the Dead for their battlefield practices. And Sanguinius transformed them. Under his leadership, the 9th Legion became the Blood Angels, named for their Primarch's appearance and for the hope of redemption he represented. He didn't try to suppress their ferocity. That would have been impossible and counterproductive. Instead, he channeled it. He taught them to embrace their savage nature as a tool while maintaining control over it. But more than that, Sanguinius gave his legion something it had never possessed: culture. He encouraged his warriors to pursue arts and crafts during times of peace. They became sculptors, painters, poets, artisans of remarkable skill. The Blood Angels' fortress monastery on Baal became filled with works of art created by superhuman hands, beauty born from minds trained for war. This wasn't just decoration or affectation. It was a deliberate strategy to give his sons something to focus on besides the constant call to violence. A way to maintain their humanity, even as they committed inhuman acts on the battlefield. The Blood Angels developed a reputation as one of the Imperium's most refined legions. Their armor was meticulously maintained, decorated with scroll work and artistry that would have been impossible for other legions to achieve. They fought with a grace that belied their savage effectiveness. They became renowned for drop assaults, for attacks launched from the air, where their skill and speed made them nearly unstoppable. They won victories across the Great Crusade, earning glory and honor while maintaining the discipline that Sanguinius insisted upon. Yet even with all this nobility, all this refinement, darkness lurked in the Blood Angels' gene seed. It had been there from the beginning, though Sanguinius didn't understand its full implications at first. Some of his warriors, seemingly at random, would succumb to an uncontrollable bloodlust during battle. The Red Thirst, as it came to be known, wasn't a new addition to the Blood Angel's nature. It had been present in the gene seed from the moment the Emperor created it, a flaw embedded so deep that even the master of mankind either couldn't remove it or didn't realize it was there. Warriors afflicted by the Red Thirst would lose themselves in battle, becoming savage beyond even the normal ferocity of Space Marines. They wouldn't just kill enemies, they would tear them apart, drink their blood, consume their flesh. The rational mind would disappear behind an overwhelming need to spill blood and consume it, to satisfy a hunger that went far beyond anything physical. And while the affected warrior might return to normal after the battle, the knowledge of what they'd done under the thirst's influence would haunt them. Sanguinius became aware of the Red Thirst during the Great Crusade, and it horrified him. He felt personally responsible for the suffering of his sons, as if the flaw in their gene seed was somehow his failing. He kept it secret from the rest of the Imperium, even from the Emperor himself, while desperately searching for a cure. He worked with his apothecaries and sanguinary priests, trying to understand the source of the thirst and how it might be excised from the Blood Angel's genetic legacy. But the cure eluded him. The thirst was too deeply embedded, too fundamental to the gene seed itself. All he could do was help his warriors develop the discipline to resist it, to fight through the urges even when every instinct screamed at them to give in. The truth that Sanguinius couldn't have known, that none of them could have known, was that this was only the beginning. The Red Thirst was terrible, certainly, but it was a manageable curse compared to what was coming. The real tragedy of the Blood Angels wouldn't manifest until the Horus Heresy, until Sanguinius faced his end aboard the Vengeful Spirit. But we'll return to that moment. For now, what's important is understanding the contrast being established. Both the World Eaters and the Blood Angels were afflicted with curses that drove them toward bloodshed. The Butcher's nails inflicted constant pain that could only be relieved through violence. The Red Thirst created an overwhelming hunger for blood that pushed warriors toward savage excess. But the key difference lay in how their primarchs responded to these afflictions. Angron embraced the nails, forcing them onto his entire legion in a misguided attempt to share his suffering. Sanguinius fought against the Red Thirst, trying to cure it, teaching his sons to master it, refusing to let it define them, even as he acknowledged its existence. This difference in leadership created fundamentally different legions. The World Eaters had no culture beyond violence. They abandoned everything that didn't directly contribute to killing. They threw away their bolters, their tactical doctrine, their ability to cooperate with other forces. They became increasingly isolated and uncontrollable, useful only as a blunt instrument to be pointed at problems and allowed to kill until the problem disappeared or they did. The Blood Angels, by contrast, maintained discipline even as they struggled with their curse. They remained capable of complex operations. They cooperated effectively with other Imperial forces. They were cultured, artistic, capable of appreciating beauty even while being instruments of death. They were everything the World Eaters were not: controlled, noble, honorable despite the darkness that lurked within them. During the Great Crusade, these two legions inevitably developed a rivalry. Both were renowned shock assault troops. Both excelled at close combat. Both had reputations for ferocity that made other legions wary of fighting beside them. But where the World Eaters were feared and barely trusted, the Blood Angels were respected and celebrated. Where Angron's warriors were seen as useful but dangerous, Sanguinius's sons were seen as heroes. This distinction bred resentment among the World Eaters, who couldn't understand why their equally savage methods were condemned, while the Blood Angels' violence was praised. The answer, of course, was in the details. When the Blood Angels fought, they fought for a purpose. They secured objectives. They followed orders. They could be trusted not to massacre civilians unless specifically ordered to do so. When the World Eaters fought, they simply killed everything in their path until nothing remained, and someone managed to pull them away from the carnage. The World Eaters won battles through sheer, overwhelming violence. The Blood Angels won battles through disciplined application of force combined with tactical excellence. This was the state of both legions when the Horus Heresy began. Two similar forces with very different cultures, led by Primarchs who embodied opposite responses to genetic curses. And when the galaxy burned and loyalty was tested, when Horus revealed his treachery and called for half the legions to join him in rebellion, the difference between these two approaches would determine whether a legion remained loyal or fell to chaos. Two curses, the nails versus the flaw. To truly understand why the World Eaters fell while the Blood Angels remained loyal, we need to examine in detail the nature of the afflictions that plagued both legions. The Butcher's nails and the flaw of Sanguinius, one artificial, one genetic, both driving warriors toward bloodshed and madness. But the mechanisms were different, the effects were different, and crucially, the ability to resist was different. The Butcher's nails were archaeotech, technology from the dark age of technology that had been perverted to a terrible purpose. They weren't true cybernetic implants in the sense that most people understood the term. They didn't add new capabilities or enhance existing ones. Instead, they were subtractive. They removed parts of what made a person human, carving away sections of the brain that dealt with emotion, reason, and pleasure. What remained was raw and broken, a mind that could only experience pain and the brief relief that came through violence. The procedure involved hammering metal spikes into the subject's skull, with cables penetrating deep into the brain tissue to wrap around specific cortical structures. In Angron's case, the cables resembled dreadlocks flowing from his head, a visible reminder of his enslavement. The mass-produced versions that the World Eater's apothecarian created for the Legion were somewhat less crude, appearing as finer wires rather than thick cables, but the fundamental mechanism was the same. Once installed, the nails continuously stimulated pain receptors throughout the brain, creating a constant background of agony that never ceased. The only way to alleviate this pain was through the neurochemical cascade triggered by violence. When a person with the nails experienced rage and acted on it, when they killed and destroyed, the implants would allow the release of pleasure chemicals that would temporarily quiet the pain. The more savage the violence, the more intense the killing, the greater and longer lasting the relief. This created a horrifying feedback loop. Warriors would crave combat not because they enjoyed fighting, but because they couldn't bear the alternative. Peace became torment. Reflection became impossible. Sleep was stolen because the pain never stopped. The nails also had other effects beyond the constant pain. They made it nearly impossible to feel fear, removing the survival instinct that kept soldiers from throwing their lives away unnecessarily. They inhibited the ability to form complex thoughts or engage in strategic planning. They made the bearer irritable and prone to sudden outbursts of violence even outside of combat. A World Eater might attack his own brothers if the nails were biting particularly hard that day, simply because they were the nearest targets and the rage needed an outlet. For Angron, the effects were even worse. As a Primarch, his version of the nails was slowly destroying his brain, degenerating the tissue in ways that would eventually prove fatal. The Mechanicum predicted he would die before the Great Crusade even concluded, his superhuman physiology unable to repair the damage fast enough to keep pace with the implant's destructive effects. He was a walking dead man, growing more unstable with each passing year, less able to coherent thought, and more driven by pure instinct toward violence. The tragedy of the butcher's nails was that they were irreversible. Once installed, they couldn't be removed without killing the host, or inflicting catastrophic brain damage that would leave them in a vegetative state. Even the Emperor, with all his power and knowledge, couldn't safely extract the nails from Angron's skull. The cables had been driven too deep, had wrapped around too many crucial structures. The Primarch was trapped by technology created by petty slavers, and nothing in the Imperium's arsenal could free him. The flaw of Sanguinius, by contrast, was genetic rather than technological, and actually consisted of two separate but related afflictions. The Red Thirst was the older of the two, present in the Blood Angels' gene seed from the moment of their creation. It manifested as an overwhelming hunger for blood, a need that went far beyond anything physical or nutritional. Blood Angels didn't require blood to survive in the way that humans need food and water, but abstaining from blood made them weaker, more irritable, more prone to aging in ways that Space Marines typically didn't experience. When a Blood Angel succumbed to the Red Thirst during battle, his vision would narrow to focus only on enemies as sources of blood. He would abandon tactics and discipline to close with the foe and tear them apart, drinking their blood and consuming their flesh in a frenzy that seemed more appropriate to a wild animal than a transhuman warrior. The affected Marine might retain enough awareness to distinguish friend from foe, or he might not. The thirst could be so overwhelming that even brothers became targets if they got too close. But unlike the butcher's nails, the Red Thirst was temporary in its most acute manifestations. A warrior who gave in during battle might return to normal afterward, though the memory of what he'd done would haunt him, and more importantly, the Red Thirst could be managed. Blood angels regularly consumed blood taken from willing serfs, bottled and stored for this purpose. It wasn't pleasant, and it carried its own psychological weight, but it helped stave off the worst effects of the thirst. Through discipline, meditation, and the support structures that Sanguinius built into the Legion's culture, blood angels could resist the call for blood even when it screamed at them to surrender. The second part of the flaw, the Black Rage, didn't exist during the Great Crusade. It only manifested after Sanguinius died aboard the Vengeful Spirit during the Siege of Terra. When Horus slew the angelic Primarch, the psychic backlash of his death echoed through every blood angel alive and every blood angel yet to be born. The gene seed that linked all of Sanguinius's sons to their father carried that death as a psychic imprint, a trauma embedded at the genetic level that would express itself across the millennia. Warriors who succumbed to the Black Rage didn't just lose control, they became lost in time, reliving Sanguinius's final moments. They would see their brothers as Horus and his traitor Marines, see the corridors around them as the passages of the Vengeful Spirit. They would fight with suicidal fury, knowing they were doomed, but determined to take as many enemies with them as possible. Unlike the Red Thirst, there was no returning from the Black Rage. Once it took hold, it was permanent. The afflicted warrior would fight until he was killed, existing in a nightmare where every moment was the moment of their Primarch's death. The Black Rage was predictable in only one way. It typically manifested on the eve of battle. Something about the approach of combat, the preparation for war, would trigger the genetic memory. Blood angels would retire to their quarters as themselves and wake screaming, trapped in Sanguinius's death over and over. The chaplains of the chapter learned to watch for the signs, to recognize when a brother was about to fall. And when it happened, that warrior would be inducted into the death company, painted black and adorned with red crosses, given the Emperor's mercy of one final battle before death claimed them. Comparing these two afflictions reveals crucial differences. The butcher's nails offered no hope. They were permanent, irreversible, and inevitably fatal, either through combat death or the slow degradation of brain tissue. They made their bearers less than they had been, stripping away capabilities and leaving only pain and the need for violence. There was no managing the nails, no ritual or discipline that could quiet them. The only relief was killing, and that relief was temporary, lasting only as long as the combat did before the pain returned. The Red Thirst, while terrible, was manageable. It could be resisted through willpower and the support structures that Sanguinius created. Blood angels could go their entire service without surrendering to it, dying with honor after centuries of fighting while maintaining their humanity. And even those who did succumb during battle often returned to themselves afterward, able to continue serving if they could live with the memory of their loss of control. The Red Thirst was a constant presence, a weight every blood angel carried, but it didn't have to define them. The Black Rage was different from both. It was inevitable for some warriors, unpredictable in when it would strike, and absolutely fatal once it manifested. But even here, there was a kind of honor available. Warriors who fell to the Black Rage were given the Death Company, a final chance to serve before death claimed them. They fought alongside their brothers one last time, their fury channeled toward the enemies of the Imperium rather than wasted on their own comrades, and they died knowing they had served to the very end, that their sacrifice meant something even in their madness. The Butcher's Nails also fundamentally changed what the World Eaters valued and how they functioned as a military force, because the only relief from pain came through personal acts of violence. World Eaters cared nothing for strategy or coordination. Shooting an enemy with a bolter from a distance provided no relief from the nails, only closing to melee range, feeling the chain axe bite into flesh, seeing the blood spray across your armor, experiencing the intimate nature of close combat. Only that triggered the neurochemical cascade that quieted the pain. So the World Eaters abandoned ranged combat almost entirely, focusing exclusively on getting into melee as quickly as possible. This made them predictable. Enemy commanders knew the World Eaters would charge directly at them regardless of terrain, regardless of casualties, regardless of tactical considerations. All you had to do was prepare for that charge, set up overlapping fields of fire, and the World Eaters would obligingly run directly into them. They would take horrific casualties getting to melee range, but they didn't care. The pain of the nails was worse than the pain of lasguns and bolter rounds tearing into their armor. Death was preferable to continuing to endure the constant agony. The Blood Angels, by contrast, remained tactically flexible. They could engage at range when necessary, though they preferred close combat. They could coordinate complex assaults with other forces. They could adapt their strategy to the enemy and the terrain. The Red Thirst whispered to them constantly, urging them to close and tear their enemies apart. But they could resist that urge long enough to do their jobs properly. They fought as Space Marines were meant to fight, with skill, discipline, and overwhelming force applied at the critical moment. Another crucial difference lay in the progression of the afflictions. The Butcher's Nails grew worse over time. The neural pathways they damaged didn't regenerate, and the constant stimulation created a tolerance effect, where more and more violence was required to achieve the same relief. Long-service World Eaters became increasingly unstable, harder to control, even by their own officers. They would attack anything that moved when the nails bit too deeply, unable to distinguish friend from foe through the haze of pain and rage. The Red Thirst also grew stronger with time, but in a different way. Young Blood Angels might go years between episodes where the thirst threatened to overwhelm them. Older warriors dealt with it more frequently, as the genetic flaw expressed itself more strongly. But this progression was gradual, and the discipline and mental techniques that Blood Angels learned became more effective with practice. An ancient warrior who had resisted the thirst for centuries had developed tools and strategies that made him better equipped to continue resisting it, even as it grew stronger. The psychological impact was also dramatically different. World Eaters knew the nails were destroying them, knew they were becoming less than they had been, knew there was no hope of cure or relief. This knowledge bred a nihilism that made concepts like honor or loyalty meaningless. What did loyalty matter when you were already damned? What did honor mean when you were being slowly transformed into a mindless killing machine? The World Eaters embraced their fate because resisting it was pointless. They might as well kill as much as possible before the nails or the enemy destroyed them. Blood Angels lived with hope. Sanguinius had promised them he would find a cure for the red thirst, and even after his death, that hope persisted. Successive chapter masters continued the search, pouring resources into understanding the flaw and developing treatments. And while no cure was ever found, the promise that one might exist someday gave Blood Angels a reason to resist. Every day they maintained control was a day closer to potential redemption. Every battle where they kept their discipline proved that their humanity could withstand the curse. The hope might have been a delusion, but it was a life-sustaining delusion that kept them fighting for something beyond simple destruction. The social structures around the two afflictions reflected these differences. The World Eaters had nothing to help their brothers cope with the nails. Angron didn't create support systems or develop techniques to manage the pain. He simply demanded that his sons endure it as he did, finding what relief they could in battle and accepting that they were doomed. The Legion's culture became increasingly sparse and brutal, stripping away anything that didn't directly contribute to violence. They had no art, no poetry, no beauty. They had only war, and even war was reduced to its most basic form. Close with the enemy and kill until nothing moves. The Blood Angels built elaborate rituals and support networks around the flaw. The sanguinary priests served both as spiritual guides and as medical specialists, monitoring their brothers for signs of the thirst or the rage. Chaplains helped warriors process the psychological weight of their curse, providing counsel and absolution for those who had succumbed. The entire chapter was structured to catch brothers before they fell, and to honor them if they did fall. No Blood Angel faced his curse alone. This created different outcomes even when warriors succumbed to their afflictions. A World Eater who lost control to the nails would simply continue killing until he was destroyed, or until the enemies ran out. He became a liability, as likely to attack his own side as the enemy if the pain grew too severe. World Eaters' officers learned to simply point their berserker brothers at the enemy and hope they died before turning on their comrades. A Blood Angel who succumbed to the red thirst during battle would be watched by his squad, who would try to keep him focused on enemy targets. After the battle, he would receive counseling and support, help processing what he'd done, and reinforcement of the discipline needed to resist the thirst next time. And a warrior who fell to the Black Rage would be honored with induction into the Death Company, given a final chance to serve with distinction before death claimed him. Even in madness, even in the grip of the curse, Blood Angels were still their brothers' keepers. Perhaps the most telling difference was in how the two Primarchs viewed their afflicted sons. Angron saw the nails as something to be shared, believing that making his entire legion suffer as he did would create understanding and solidarity. He was wrong, but he never acknowledged that error. He forced the nails onto tens of thousands of warriors, damning them all because he couldn't bear being alone in his torment. And when they became increasingly uncontrollable, when they started killing indiscriminately, he felt vindicated rather than guilty. This, he believed, was what they all deserved for serving the emperor who had abandoned his gladiator family. Sanguinius saw the flaw as his personal failing. He took responsibility for every son who fell to the red thirst, every warrior who lost control. He worked tirelessly to find a cure, to develop management techniques, to build the support structures that would help his sons maintain their humanity. He never blamed his warriors for their curse. He blamed himself. And that guilt drove him to be better, to demand more of himself so that his example might help them resist. Where Angron spread his curse intentionally, Sanguinius tried desperately to cure the one he'd unintentionally passed on. These differences in the nature of the curses, in how they were managed, in what they meant for the afflicted warriors, all contributed to why one legion fell to chaos while the other remained loyal. The Butcher's Nails created warriors with nothing to lose, no hope for redemption, no reason to resist when Horus offered them unlimited opportunities for violence. The flaw of Sanguinius created warriors fighting constantly to maintain their humanity, who had built entire cultures around resistance and discipline, who had too much to lose to surrender to damnation. The Great Crusade. Parallel warriors. During the Great Crusade, the World Eaters and Blood Angels both earned reputations as the Imperium's premier shock assault troops. They were the legions you called when a world absolutely had to be broken, when conventional tactics had failed, when the only answer was overwhelming force delivered with surgical precision to the enemy's most critical positions. But the ways they earned these reputations, the methods they employed, and the costs they incurred were vastly different. The Blood Angels excelled at planetary assault from orbit. Their fortress monastery on Baal had been designed around this doctrine, with extensive training facilities for drop pod assaults and aerial insertion. Every Blood Angel was trained to function as part of a coordinated strike force descending from the heavens. They would identify the enemy's command and control centers, their most valuable strategic assets, and hit them with overwhelming force before the defenders could properly respond. Speed, precision, and controlled aggression were their hallmarks. A typical Blood Angel's assault would begin with thorough reconnaissance. Sanguinius insisted on intelligence gathering before committing his forces. Once targets were identified, assault squads would drop in waves, each with specific objectives. The initial strike would secure landing zones and eliminate anti-air capabilities. Subsequent waves would push toward primary objectives while maintaining communication and coordination. Throughout the assault, Blood Angels officers maintained tactical flexibility, adapting to changing circumstances while keeping the overall strategy in focus. The World Eaters approached planetary assault very differently. Intelligence gathering was minimal to non-existent. Angron rarely bothered with reconnaissance, believing that it didn't matter what the enemy's disposition was when the World Eaters' solution to every problem was the same: charge directly at it and keep killing until it stopped being a problem. Drop pods would hammer down in loose formations, sometimes not even coordinating landing zones. Individual World Eaters would simply head toward the nearest enemy concentration and start killing, with no particular regard for objectives or coordination with their brothers. This approach actually worked surprisingly often, at least in the short term. The World Eaters' complete commitment to melee assault, their absolute fearlessness born of the Nails' suppression of survival instinct, their willingness to take casualties that other legions would find unacceptable. All of this made them devastatingly effective at breaking enemy formations. No one wanted to face World Eaters in close combat. Their reputation preceded them, and the psychological impact of watching chain-axe-wielding berserkers charge through withering fire without slowing down broke many defensive lines before the actual melee even began. But the cost was staggering. World Eaters took casualties at rates that made other legions' commanders wince. They didn't care about cover, didn't use fire and maneuver tactics, didn't suppress enemy positions before assaulting them. They just charged, trusting their armor and enhanced physiology to carry them through the killing zone. Many World Eaters died in these charges, cut down before they ever reached melee range. The survivors would then butcher the enemy with savage efficiency before looking for the next target to assault. The Blood Angels' casualty rates were dramatically lower because they fought smart. They used suppressing fire. They exploited cover and terrain. They coordinated their assaults to hit the enemy from multiple angles simultaneously. They were just as deadly in close combat as the World Eaters, possibly more so because they retained the clarity of thought to aim their strikes rather than simply hacking away at anything nearby. But they reached close combat with their squads intact and their tactical situation under control, rather than as scattered survivors of a suicidal charge. The strategic implications of these different approaches became apparent as the Great Crusade progressed. The Blood Angels could be trusted with complex, multi-stage operations where success depended on achieving objectives in the correct sequence. Sanguinius could receive orders from the War Master, develop a campaign plan, and execute it with the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. His legion worked well alongside other Imperial forces, coordinating their assaults to complement the strengths of different units. The World Eaters could only be pointed at a target and unleashed. They were a blunt instrument, useful when you needed something destroyed and didn't care about the details of how it happened. Angron rarely participated in strategic planning sessions with other Primarchs. His contribution to any discussion was predictable. His legion would attack the enemy's strongest position head-on, while everyone else did whatever they wanted. The World Eaters weren't interested in supporting other forces or being supported. They would charge in and kill until victory was achieved, or they were all dead. This limited utility meant the World Eaters were increasingly deployed alone, or alongside other legions known for their brutality. They fought with the Night Lords, whose terror tactics and tendency toward atrocity made them natural partners for a legion that didn't care about civilian casualties. They occasionally worked with the Space Wolves, though that partnership was always uneasy, given the Wolves' strong sense of honor and the World Eaters' complete lack thereof. But they were rarely paired with legions like the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, whose methodical approach to warfare was fundamentally incompatible with the World Eaters' savage directness. The Blood Angels, by contrast, were welcome partners for any legion. They had fought alongside the Ultramarines with great success, their aggressive assault doctrine complementing the 13th Legion's strategic flexibility. They coordinated effectively with the Imperial Fists, whose defensive expertise created opportunities for Blood Angels to launch devastating counterattacks. Even the Dark Angels, generally aloof and secretive, appreciated the Blood Angels' honor and martial excellence. Sanguinius himself was beloved by nearly all his brothers, respected even by Primarchs who were themselves difficult to impress. The rivalry between the two legions grew from this difference in reputation and utility. World Eaters resented that the Blood Angels were celebrated, while they were merely tolerated. They saw the 9th Legion as getting credit for essentially the same thing the 12th Legion did: close with the enemy and kill them in melee. That the Blood Angels did it with discipline and art, while the World Eaters did it with raw savagery, seemed like an irrelevant distinction to warriors whose brains were being eaten by the butcher's nails. There were incidents where the rivalry became open conflict. On several worlds, World Eaters and Blood Angels were deployed simultaneously, and the competition to prove which legion was more effective led to both forces taking unnecessary risks. World Eaters would launch assaults before proper reconnaissance was complete, trying to secure objectives before the Blood Angels could claim credit. Blood Angels, feeling the sting of implied cowardice, would accelerate their own timelines, pushing their warriors harder than necessary to prove they were just as aggressive as their rivals. These competitions rarely ended well. The World Eaters' approach meant they often secured objectives quickly but at terrible cost, and with significant collateral damage. The Blood Angels would achieve their objectives with lower casualties and minimal civilian harm, but sometimes arrived to find the World Eaters had already taken the target through sheer brutality. Each legion could claim victory, and each could point to the other's approach as flawed. The World Eaters said the Blood Angels were too slow and too concerned with meaningless details like civilian casualties. The Blood Angels said the World Eaters were wasteful of their own lives and created more problems than they solved through their indiscriminate violence. The truth was that both legions were remarkable fighting forces, but only one was actually sustainable as a military institution. The Blood Angels could replenish their losses through normal recruitment and training, bringing new warriors into a culture that would shape them into effective Space Marines. The World Eaters' recruitment became increasingly difficult as the nails took their toll. Potential recruits who survived the implantation process would immediately become unstable and violent, making training difficult. Many died in accidents or training incidents before ever seeing real combat. The Legion was slowly consuming itself, burning through warriors faster than they could be replaced. Angron didn't care about sustainability. He believed the World Eaters would all be dead before the Great Crusade ended anyway, either killed in combat or destroyed by the nails' degradation of their brains. The Legion existed to kill, and when all the killing was done, they could die together. This nihilistic philosophy made the World Eaters even more reckless, even more willing to take casualties, because they believed themselves already doomed. Sanguinius cared deeply about his legion's future. He wanted the Blood Angels to endure, to be a permanent force for the Imperium even after the Great Crusade achieved its goals. He built infrastructure, developed training programs, created the cultural institutions that would preserve the Legion's character across generations. He thought in terms of centuries and millennia, building something that would last long after he was gone. Every blood angel who died under his command weighed on him personally, a failure to preserve what he was trying to create. The two Primarchs rarely interacted directly during the Great Crusade. When they did, the meetings were uncomfortable. Sanguinius represented everything Angron hated. Nobility earned through birth rather than suffering. Loyalty to a father who had abandoned his true family. Refinement that seemed like weakness to a slave gladiator. Angron represented everything that saddened Sanguinius. Wasted potential. Unnecessary suffering. A legion that could have been great being destroyed by its own Primarch's choices. They had nothing to say to each other that wouldn't deepen the gulf between them. But both Primarchs were keenly aware of their legion's similarities. Both knew their sons struggled with bloodlust and rage. Both had seen warriors lose control to the call of violence. Angron had chosen to embrace that loss of control, to make it his legion's defining feature. Sanguinius had chosen to fight it, to build discipline and honor as bulwarks against the red thirst. These opposing responses to similar curses created fundamentally different legions from similar raw materials. As the Great Crusade drew toward its conclusion, as the final non-compliant human worlds were brought into the Imperium, both legions faced uncertain futures. The World Eaters were dying, their numbers declining as casualties outpaced recruitment and the Nails claimed more victims. Angron himself was deteriorating rapidly, his moments of lucidity becoming rare as the implants consumed more of his brain. The Legion had maybe a few more decades before it ceased to exist as a viable fighting force, barring some radical intervention. The Blood Angels, by contrast, were thriving. They had secured Baal and its surrounding system as their domain. Their fortress monastery was complete, a masterwork of architecture and engineering that would serve as their home for millennia. They had established recruitment worlds and training protocols. They had built a culture that would sustain them across the ages. Sanguinius still searched desperately for a cure to the red thirst. But even without one, the Blood Angels seemed positioned to endure indefinitely as one of the Imperium's premier fighting forces. Then Horus, the favored son, the War Master chosen by the Emperor to lead the Great Crusade, while the Master of Mankind returned to Terra, revealed his treachery. The greatest general in the Imperium turned traitor, and he called on his brothers to join him in rebellion against the Emperor. And in that moment, the future that both legions had been building toward shattered, replaced by civil war on a scale that would nearly destroy the Imperium itself. The World Eaters joined Horus without hesitation. Angron had been waiting for this moment, an opportunity to strike at the Emperor who had denied him his honorable death alongside his gladiator family. The Blood Angels remained loyal without question. Sanguinius would never betray his father, would never turn from the dream of united humanity that the Emperor represented. And so two similar legions found themselves on opposite sides of the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen. The Horus Heresy. Diverging paths. The Horus heresy transformed both the World Eaters and Blood Angels in profound ways, though the changes took very different forms. For the World Eaters, the heresy was less a transformation and more a permission slip. They had already been savage, already been barely controlled. Now they were given free rein to indulge every brutal impulse without even the minimal constraints that imperial service had imposed. For the Blood Angels, the heresy brought horror and loss, culminating in a psychic wound that would afflict the Legion forever. The World Eaters distinguished themselves during the heresy for their absolute commitment to slaughter. At Istvan III, where Horus purged his own legions of loyalist elements, the World Eaters led the assault with their usual savage enthusiasm. They fell upon their own brothers, those who had remained loyal to the Emperor, and butchered them without hesitation or mercy. The betrayal meant nothing to warriors already divorced from concepts like loyalty or honor. They were simply given new targets and told to kill, and they did so with the same mindless efficiency they brought to every battle. During this period, the World Eaters began their full descent into worship of Khorne. The Blood God had been watching them for years, appreciating their dedication to violence even before they knew his name. Khorne valued martial prowess, bloodshed, and the taking of skulls above all else. The World Eaters were already serving him in all but name, their entire existence devoted to killing as many enemies as possible in the most brutal ways imaginable. Formalizing that relationship just meant they received demonic gifts in exchange for continuing to do what they were already doing. Khorne's blessings amplified what the World Eaters already were. Warriors who survived particularly impressive battles might find themselves growing larger, stronger, more resistant to injury. Their armor would fuse with their flesh, becoming part of them. Some developed mutations that made them even more effective killers, extra limbs holding additional weapons, enhanced speed, skin that turned blades. These changes were rewards for service to the Blood God, marks of favor that pushed recipients further from their original humanity. Angron himself underwent the most dramatic transformation. During the Shadow Crusade, a campaign of brutal planet-killing conducted alongside Lorgar word-bearers, the World Eater's Primarch was dying. The Butcher's nails had finally degraded his brain past the point where even Primarch healing could compensate. He was incoherent more often than not, capable only of violence, his moments of awareness brief and pain-racked. Lorgar, seeing his brother's suffering and believing he had a solution, arranged a demonic ritual on the world of Nuceria, Angron's hated homeworld. The ritual transformed Angron into a demon Primarch, the first of the traitor Primarchs to undergo this change. His physical body was destroyed and reconstituted as a being of pure warp energy, wearing flesh as a disguise. He became enormous, wings sprouting from his back, his body wreathed in flames that burned without consuming him. The Butcher's nails remained, visible as brass fixtures embedded in his skull, but they no longer caused him pain. Instead, they had become part of his demonic nature, symbols of his devotion to Khorne rather than instruments of torture. As a demon, Angron was, in some ways, more coherent than he had been in his final mortal years. The constant agony of the nails was gone, replaced by a different kind of existence, but he was also bound by the rules that governed all demons, unable to remain in real space indefinitely, dependent on specific conditions and rituals to manifest. He had traded mortality for immortality, but it was an immortality that came with severe restrictions. He existed now primarily in the warp, able to enter the materium only during specific conjunctions or when called forth by his worshippers. The Blood Angels' journey through the heresy was completely different. They remained loyal from the moment of Horus's treachery, never wavering in their service to the Emperor. But Horus knew Sanguinius was too dangerous to leave unchecked. The angel was beloved by his brothers, respected across the Imperium, and possessed both the martial prowess and strategic brilliance to rally loyalist forces effectively. So Horus laid a trap for the Blood Angels, one designed to corrupt or destroy them before they could threaten his rebellion. The trap was sprung at Cygnus Prime, a star system that Horus claimed needed to be brought into compliance. He sent the Blood Angels to deal with it, knowing full well that Cygnus had been claimed by the forces of chaos. The entire system was a nightmare made real, with demons prowling the planets and the warp bleeding into reality. It was the perfect environment to break a legion already struggling with the red thirst, to push them past the point where they could resist and let them drown in their own bloodlust. The campaign at Cygnus Prime was a horror beyond description. The Blood Angels found themselves fighting demons in environments where reality itself was unstable. The red thirst roared through the Legion with unprecedented strength, fueled by the warp's proximity and the constant violence. Warriors who had resisted the thirst for decades suddenly found themselves overwhelmed, losing control and attacking anything nearby in frenzied attempts to sate their hunger for blood. Sanguinius himself faced the greatest demon of Cygnus, a massive bloodthirster of Khorne named Kabanda. Their duel was legendary, an angel against a demon, both beings of impossible power fighting for the soul of a legion. Kabanda broke Sanguinius's legs during their first encounter, crippling the Primarch and forcing the Blood Angels to witness their father's defeat. The psychological impact was devastating. If even Sanguinius could fall, what hope did they have? But Sanguinius refused to surrender. He healed, returned to the fight, and in their rematch, he killed Kabanda so decisively that the demon would be banished for years. The angel rallied his sons, led them through the nightmare of Cygnus Prime, and brought them out the other side still loyal, still committed to the Emperor despite everything the forces of chaos had thrown at them. It was one of the Blood Angels' finest moments, proof that their discipline and honor could withstand even direct assault by the ruinous powers. But Cygnus Prime changed the Blood Angels. The intensity of the experience, the depth of the red thirst's call, the sheer horror of what they'd fought through, all of it left psychic scars. Warriors who had never surrendered to the thirst before found themselves fighting it constantly. The Legion emerged from Cygnus Prime more traumatized, but also more determined. They had been tested by chaos itself and remained loyal. That achievement was a source of pride that would sustain them through the even worse trials to come. The two legions finally met in battle during the Siege of Terra, the climactic engagement of the Horus Heresy, where the traitor forces attempted to storm the imperial palace and kill the emperor. The World Eaters were among the most fanatical attackers, throwing themselves at the palace walls with complete disregard for casualties. They cared nothing for strategy or coordination with other traitor forces. They simply charged, wave after wave, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers and savagery. The Blood Angels were among the defenders, fighting to protect the Emperor and everything the Imperium represented. They held critical positions along the walls, coordinating with other loyalist forces to repel assault after assault. Blood Angels and World Eaters met in brutal melee combat in the breaches and on the ramparts, former brothers killing each other with the same weapons they'd once used against the Imperium's enemies. These battles were particularly vicious because both legions excelled at exactly the same type of combat. It wasn't a matter of ranged troops fighting melee specialists or heavily armored forces against light infantry. It was chain axe against chain axe, both sides fighting with superhuman strength and speed, both intimately familiar with the other's tactics. The death toll on both sides was staggering, but the Blood Angels held their positions while the World Eaters died in their thousands trying to break through. The siege culminated when the Emperor, Sanguinius, and Rogel Dorn teleported aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, to confront the War Master directly. Horus had been empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods, transformed into something far beyond a normal Primarch. He was a living weapon designed for one purpose: to kill the Emperor and shatter the Imperium forever. The Emperor knew this confrontation was necessary, that Horus had to be stopped before he could achieve even more power. But he took Sanguinius with him, because the angel was one of the few beings who might be able to wound a chaos-empowered Primarch. Sanguinius reached Horus first, confronting his beloved brother in the throne room of the Vengeful Spirit. There was a moment, witnesses later said, where Sanguinius tried to reach the Horus he remembered, the brother he'd fought alongside during the Great Crusade. But that Horus was gone, consumed by chaos and ambition. The War Master offered Sanguinius one final chance to join him, to stand at his side when he claimed the Imperium. The angel refused, and the battle was joined. Even weakened by his time on Cygnus Prime, even exhausted from fighting through the Vengeful Spirit's corridors, Sanguinius was magnificent. He fought with the skill and power that had made him legendary, his blade striking with precision that threatened even the empowered Horus. For a moment, it seemed possible that he might actually win, that the angel could defeat the War Master and end the heresy with a single stroke. But Horus was too strong, too filled with the power of the Chaos Gods. He broke through Sanguinius's guard and struck a blow that would have killed any other being instantly. The angel fell, his last thoughts reaching out to his sons, a final psychic cry that carried across the galaxy. Every Blood Angel alive felt their father die, felt the moment when his light was extinguished. And every Blood Angel yet to be born would carry that death as a genetic memory, a wound that would never heal. The Emperor arrived moments later, finding his beloved son dead at Horus's feet. What happened next is recorded in Imperial legend. The Emperor, finally understanding that Horus was beyond redemption, struck him down with psychic power that obliterated the War Master's soul. But the effort cost the Emperor everything. He was mortally wounded, reduced to a corpse kept barely alive by the Golden Throne, a sacrifice made to avenge Sanguinius and prevent chaos from claiming ultimate victory. The heresy ended with the traitor forces fleeing into the Eye of Terror, pursued by loyalist fleets. The World Eaters scattered, their legion structure breaking down as individual warbands went their own ways. Angron, now a demon Primarch, could only rarely manifest in real space, and without his presence, there was nothing holding the World Eaters together as a unified force. They became pirates and raiders, dedicated only to spilling blood for Khorne, attacking Imperial and non-Imperial targets with equal enthusiasm. The Blood Angels returned to Baal, carrying their dead and their grief. They had remained loyal, had fought with honor, had sacrificed everything to defend the Emperor. But the cost was almost unbearable. Their Primarch was dead, killed by a traitor brother. The psychic wound of Sanguinius's death had created the Black Rage, a new curse that would afflict them forever. And the Red Thirst, already a constant struggle, had been strengthened by their experiences at Cygnus Prime and during the siege. 2 legions, both defined by rage and bloodlust, emerged from the Horus heresy on completely different trajectories. One had fallen to chaos and fragmented, becoming a scattered threat that served the blood god through mindless slaughter. The other had proven their loyalty and discipline, paying a terrible price for their honor, but remaining true to their purpose. The question was whether that loyalty would be enough to sustain them through the 10,000 years that followed. After the fall, 10,000 years. The 10 millennia since the Horus heresy have seen the World Eaters and Blood Angels continue their divergent paths. World Eaters exist now as scattered warbands, operating out of the Eye of Terror and other warp storms. They launch raids against Imperial and alien worlds alike, seeking only to kill and take skulls for Khorne. They have no grand strategy, no overarching goals beyond accumulating more blood and skulls. They are the purest expression of Khorne's creed, murder made manifest. Warriors who exist only to kill. The Blood Angels, by contrast, have become one of the Imperium's most storied and honored chapters. They defend entire sectors of space, respond to threats across the galaxy, and maintain the traditions and nobility that Sanguinius instilled in them 10,000 years ago. They fight not for glory or bloodlust, though both are present, but for humanity's survival and the hope that someday they might be freed from their curse. The structure of both forces reflects their fundamentally different natures. The World Eaters have no legion-wide organization anymore. Each warband operates independently under a champion who has proven himself through violence and accumulated enough of Khorne's favor to command other berserkers. These warbands range in size from a few dozen warriors to several hundred, and they cooperate only when their goals temporarily align. After achieving whatever objective brought them together, they inevitably turn on each other, because Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it flows. Karn the Betrayer stands as perhaps the most infamous World Eater still active in the 41st millennium. He was the first to survive the implantation of the Butcher's nails after Angron ordered their adoption. He served as the Legion's equerry during the Great Crusade and Heresy, and after 10,000 years, he remains a terror on the battlefield, blessed by Khorne with immortality and the ability to inspire other warriors to greater heights of violence. But even Karn doesn't lead the World Eaters in any meaningful sense. He simply shows up where the fighting is fiercest and kills until there's nothing left to kill. And other World Eaters follow him, because being near Karn guarantees opportunities for glorious slaughter. The warbands emerge from the Eye of Terror or other warp rifts to launch raids against targets across the galaxy. They attack Imperial worlds, alien civilizations, even other chaos forces if the opportunity presents itself. Their raids follow no strategic pattern because they have no strategy beyond kill everything. They descend on a world, slaughter as many people as possible, take skulls as offerings to Khorne, and either die in the fighting or retreat back to the warp when Imperial response forces arrive in strength. These raids are devastating to the worlds they hit, but they're also tactically limited. The World Eaters can't hold territory because they can't stop killing long enough to establish control. They can't build anything because they've lost the knowledge and capability for anything besides combat. They're a purely destructive force, capable of terrible damage, but incapable of achieving lasting victory. They're less a military force and more a recurring natural disaster, like a hurricane made of chain axes and rage. Angron himself occasionally manifests in real space during particularly propitious conjunctions or when summoned by his worshippers through elaborate rituals. When the demon Primarch appears, entire worlds die. He's grown even larger and more terrible since his transformation during the Heresy, and his mere presence causes reality to buckle and warp. Mortals who see him often go mad or spontaneously combust from the psychic pressure of being near a being of such concentrated violence and warp energy. But Angron's manifestations are temporary. After a period ranging from days to months, the conditions that allowed him to exist in real space fail, and he's pulled back into the warp. He rages against this limitation, but even a demon Primarch can't permanently override the fundamental laws that govern how warp entities interact with the Materium. So he appears, kills millions, and vanishes, leaving his sons to continue the slaughter without him until the next time he can be called forth. The Blood Angels situation is far more structured, but also far more psychologically complex. They maintain the chapter organization established after the Heresy, with companies led by captains, under the overall command of the chapter master. Their fortress monastery on Baal serves as both home and symbol, a massive structure that speaks to the permanence and stability Sanguinius wanted for his legion. They recruit from Baal and its moons, taking in aspirants who undergo the brutal transformation into Space Marines while being indoctrinated into the chapter's culture. But every Blood Angel lives under the shadow of the flaw. The red thirst remains as strong as ever, a constant hunger that must be managed through discipline and the ritual consumption of blood. The black rage looms over every brother, the knowledge that at any moment, usually on the eve of battle, he might wake up trapped in the final moments of Sanguinius's life, doomed to die reliving his Primarch's death forever. The chapter has developed elaborate coping mechanisms for both aspects of the flaw. Sanguinary priests monitor every brother's spiritual and physical health, watching for signs that the thirst is growing too strong or that the rage is about to manifest. They provide counseling and support, helping warriors process the constant psychological pressure of knowing they carry a genetic time bomb that could detonate at any moment. They also oversee the collection and distribution of blood, ensuring that brothers can satisfy the thirst in controlled ways rather than losing control during battle. The chaplains serve a similar but distinct role, focusing on the spiritual and psychological aspects of being a blood angel. They lead the chapter in prayer and meditation, conduct rituals that reinforce discipline and honor, and help warriors understand that their curse doesn't define them. A blood angel is not his flaw. He is what he chooses to do despite the flaw. The chaplains hammer this message home constantly because it's the only thing that keeps some warriors from giving in to despair. When a brother falls to the black rage, the response is ritualized and honored. The afflicted warrior is inducted into the Death Company, a formation that exists at the margins of the chapter's organization. Death Company Marines are painted black, their armor adorned with red crosses, symbolizing the wounds Sanguinius suffered. They're equipped with close combat weapons and jump packs, then led into battle by a chaplain who serves as their guide and guardian. The role of the Death Company chaplain is unique and terrible. He must shepherd warriors who are lost in madness, ensuring they die fighting the chapter's enemies rather than attacking their own brothers. Death Company Marines fight with absolute fearlessness and savage fury, channeling the rage of Sanguinius's final moments into service against the Imperium's enemies. They're nearly impossible to stop, feeling no pain, accepting no surrender, attacking with the certainty that they're going to die, and the determination to take as many enemies with them as possible. Most don't survive their first battle with the Death Company, dying heroically, but completely. Those few who survive one battle are kept in the company for the next, and the next, until death inevitably claims them. There's no recovering from the black rage. There's only one final service before the darkness takes everything. The Death Company serves multiple purposes within the chapter. Practically, they're an incredibly effective shock assault unit, useful for missions where normal tactics would result in unacceptable casualties. Spiritually, they're a reminder of what every blood angel carries within himself, a manifestation of the curse made visible. And psychologically, they offer a kind of comfort. When a brother falls to the rage, he doesn't simply die or go mad in isolation. He's honored, given a final chance to serve, allowed to die with dignity, fighting for the Emperor. The Death Company represents the chapter's commitment that no brother faces his curse alone. that even in madness, there can be honor. The Blood Angels have also maintained the cultural traditions that Sanguinius established during the Great Crusade. Art, poetry, sculpture, music, all of these flourish within the chapter. The fortress monastery is filled with masterworks created by superhuman hands, beauty that serves as a counterweight to the violence that defines Space Marine existence. Brothers pursue these crafts during the long periods between deployments, finding in creative expression an outlet for feelings that the Red Thirst tries to channel only toward violence. This focus on culture isn't mere affectation. It's a deliberate strategy to maintain humanity in warriors who are constantly pushed toward monstrous excess. When a Blood Angel carves a sculpture or composes a poem, he's exercising parts of his mind that the Red Thirst wants him to abandon. He's proving to himself that he's more than just a weapon, that beauty and honor still have meaning even in a universe of constant war. The art doesn't cure the flaw, but it helps brothers resist it, gives them something to fight for, beyond mere survival. The Blood Angels have earned tremendous renown across the Imperium for their service. They're called upon to respond to the most dangerous threats, to hold critical positions, to lead assaults where success seems impossible. Their reputation is such that other chapters consider it an honor to fight alongside them. And Imperial commanders know that if Blood Angels are assigned to a campaign, victory is achievable no matter how long the odds. But this renown comes at a cost. The Blood Angels must constantly prove they're still loyal, still trustworthy, still in control of their curse. There are factions within the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy who believe the flaw of Sanguinius is evidence of chaos corruption, that any chapter carrying such a genetic defect should be declared excommunicated traitorous and purged. The Blood Angels must therefore be above reproach in all their actions, must never give ammunition to those who would see them destroyed. One incident of a Blood Angel losing control and attacking civilians, one case of the Red Thirst manifesting in a way that can't be explained away, and the entire chapter might face investigation or worse. This pressure creates a kind of perfectionism that permeates Blood Angels' culture. They must not only resist their curse, but resist it visibly and completely. They must not only achieve victory, but achieve it with honor and minimal collateral damage. They must not only serve the Emperor, but serve him with such devotion that their loyalty can never be questioned. The weight of this expectation is crushing, adding yet another layer of psychological strain to warriors already struggling with genetic curses that drive them toward madness and bloodlust. The successor chapters descended from Blood Angels' gene seed faced the same challenges. The Flesh Terrors, Blood Drinkers, Lamenters, and dozens of other chapters all carry the flaw of Sanguinius. Some have managed it better than others. The Flesh Terrors are known for barely controlled savagery, their reputation for excessive violence making even other Space Marines wary. The Blood Drinkers have developed rituals around blood consumption that some consider borderline heretical. The Lamenters are beset by terrible luck, but maintain their honor through every catastrophe. Each successor chapter represents a different response to the same curse. different strategies for managing what cannot be cured. The Blood Angels maintain contact with their successors, sharing information about the flaw and coordinating research into potential cures or treatments. Every few centuries, representatives from all the Blood Angels' successor chapters gather for a conclave where they discuss their shared curse and any progress toward understanding it. These meetings are somber affairs, as chapter masters and senior officers acknowledge that after 10,000 years, they're no closer to a cure than they were when Sanguinius first discovered the Red Thirst during the Great Crusade. This lack of progress weighs heavily on the Blood Angels. Sanguinius promised them he would find a cure. He failed, through no fault of his own. He died before he could complete his research. But the promise remains, and every Blood Angel who has ever served carries the hope that maybe this generation will be the one that finally unlocks the secret, that finally frees them from the curse that has defined them for 10 millennia. The hope grows dimmer with each passing century, but it never completely dies, because hope is all they have to sustain them through the endless cycle of resisting the flaw and mourning brothers who fall to it. In the current era, the 41st millennium, both the World Eaters and Blood Angels continue their paths. The World Eaters serve Khorne by launching raids from the Eye of Terror, killing indiscriminately, caring nothing for strategy or victory beyond the accumulation of skulls. They're scattered, degraded, barely recognizable as the Space Marine Legion they once were. They've become exactly what Angron always believed they would become: weapons that kill until they're destroyed, existing only for violence with no higher purpose or meaning. The Blood Angels stand as defenders of the Imperium, honored and celebrated despite their curse. They maintain the nobility that Sanguinius instilled in them, fighting with discipline and honor even when the Red Thirst screams at them to surrender to savagery. They endure the Black Rage stoically, honoring brothers who fall to it with the Death Company and the promise of a glorious final battle. They create art and beauty in a universe that seems designed to crush both. They represent humanity's potential for greatness even in the face of corruption and decay. Two legions, born with similar curses, have arrived at completely different destinations after 10,000 years. One has fallen so far that it barely remembers what it once was. The other has risen despite its curse, becoming something greater than it might have been without that constant struggle. The question that haunts anyone who studies their histories is simple: what made the difference? The balance. Control versus surrender. The fundamental distinction between the World Eaters and Blood Angels comes down to a single choice repeated across 10,000 years by thousands of individual warriors: whether to control the rage or surrender to it. This choice, made moment by moment in situations of extreme stress and violence, has created the vast gulf between a scattered chaos war band and one of the Imperium's most honored chapters. The Butcher's nails made controlling rage nearly impossible. That was their design purpose: to remove the subject's ability to resist violence, to make killing the only relief from constant agony. A World Eater with the nails couldn't choose to be calm, because calm meant pain beyond endurance. He couldn't engage in complex thought because the nails degraded the neural structures that enabled abstract reasoning. He couldn't form deep relationships because the nails made him irritable and violent even toward people he cared about. The nails didn't just make him want to kill, they made him need to kill. And they removed most of the mental tools that might have let him resist that need. This was fundamentally different from the red thirst. Yes, the thirst created a powerful urge toward bloodshed and blood consumption. Yes, it could overwhelm a warrior's will under the right circumstances. But it didn't remove the capacity for choice. A blood angel feeling the thirst surge could still think, could still evaluate his situation, could still decide to resist even when every instinct screamed at him to give in. The thirst was a weight pressing down on him, sometimes crushingly heavy, but it didn't strip away his humanity the way the nails did. The black rage was different again. It was inevitable once it manifested, offering no opportunity for resistance. But even the rage could be managed at the chapter level, channeled through the Death Company into one final service, rather than wasted on attacking brothers or innocents. And more importantly, the rage was unpredictable. A blood angel might serve for centuries without ever falling to it, dying in battle with his mind intact and his honor preserved. It was a threat, but not a certainty. The nails, by contrast, were constant and universal. Every World Eater suffered every moment of every day. The different structures of support around these afflictions also mattered tremendously. Angron never built support systems for his sons because he couldn't conceive of resisting the nails. His solution to his suffering was to make everyone else suffer the same way, as if shared misery would create the brotherhood he'd known in the gladiatorial pits. But suffering shared isn't suffering reduced. It's just more people suffering. The World Eaters had no traditions, no rituals, no culture beyond violence, because Angron never gave them anything else. He led by example, and his example was of a broken man who had surrendered completely to his rage and pain. Sanguinius built elaborate support structures specifically to help his sons resist. The sanguinary priests, the chaplains, the cultural emphasis on art and beauty, the rituals around blood consumption, the honor given to those who fell to the black rage. All of these were tools designed to help blood angels maintain their humanity. Sanguinius led by example too, and his example was of a being who struggled constantly with his nature but never surrendered. He felt the pull of the red thirst just as his sons did, but he resisted it every day, proving that resistance was possible. This difference in leadership created different cultures, and culture is what determines behavior when instinct and genetics are pushing toward one outcome. World Eater's culture said that giving in to violence was inevitable and even desirable, that trying to maintain discipline or honor was pointless, that the only thing that mattered was killing as much as possible before you died or the nails destroyed your brain. Blood Angel's culture said that resisting the curse was the highest form of service, that maintaining honor despite the flaw was what separated them from monsters, that every moment of control was a victory worth celebrating. The practical effects of these different cultures became apparent in how the two forces fought. World Eater's tactics were simple to the point of non-existence. Identify the enemy, charge directly at them, kill everything, repeat until you die or run out of enemies. This made them predictable. Enemy commanders knew exactly what World Eaters would do in any situation, because they only ever did one thing. You could prepare for them, set traps for them, channel them into kill zones. They would charge into those kill zones anyway because the nails didn't leave room for caution or tactical flexibility. Blood Angel's tactics were sophisticated and adaptive. They could fight at range when necessary, though they preferred close combat. They could coordinate complex multi-phase operations. They could retreat when retreat was the correct tactical decision. They could adapt to enemy responses and exploit weaknesses as they emerged. The red thirst might make them want to charge mindlessly forward, but their training and discipline gave them the tools to resist that urge long enough to fight smart rather than just fighting hard. This difference meant the Blood Angels were actually effective as a military force, while the World Eaters were merely destructive. Effectiveness requires achieving objectives. The Blood Angels could be given a goal: secure this position, eliminate this target, hold this line, and they would achieve it through whatever means were necessary. The World Eaters could only destroy. If the objective happened to align with kill everything in this area, they could achieve it. If it required any nuance or discrimination, they would fail, because they were incapable of such things. The social dynamics within each force reflected these differences. World Eaters' warbands were held together by the weakest of bonds. A champion who could kill his rivals and intimidate the rest into following him could lead for a time. But constant challenges and the inherent instability of warriors with the nails meant leadership was always temporary. Warbands formed, achieved some objective, and dissolved back into smaller groups. There was no loyalty beyond convenience and fear. Brothers fought beside each other only because they happened to be pointed at the same target at the same moment. Blood Angels developed deep bonds of brotherhood. The shared struggle against the flaw created solidarity. When you knew that your battle brother was fighting the same internal war you fought every day, when you'd seen him resist the thirst in situations where surrendering would have been easier, when you'd helped him through moments of weakness and been helped through your own, you formed connections that went beyond mere military necessity. Blood Angels would die for each other, not just because tactics demanded it, but because they genuinely cared about their brother's welfare. The long-term sustainability of the two approaches was dramatically different. The World Eaters were consuming themselves, had been consuming themselves since the butcher's nails were first adopted. Every World Eater would eventually die in combat, or from neural degradation, and replacing them was nearly impossible. Recruitment meant finding aspirants, putting them through the brutal process of becoming Space Marines, and then immediately implanting them with the nails, which had a high mortality rate even in successful cases. The survivors would be unstable and violent, requiring constant supervision to prevent them from killing their trainers. The World Eaters as an organization were always dying, always in decline, held together only by momentum and Khorne's favor. The Blood Angels were sustainable because they could recruit and train normally. Yes, aspirants would carry the flaw once they received Blood Angel's gene seed, but they wouldn't immediately become uncontrollable. They could be trained in tactics, indoctrinated into the chapter's culture, taught the discipline necessary to resist the red thirst. The loss rate to the Black Rage meant the Blood Angels had higher attrition than some chapters, but they could replace losses through normal recruitment. The chapter could persist indefinitely as long as Baal and its recruitment worlds remained viable. The psychological toll was also distributed differently. World Eaters suffered constantly and universally. Every single one was in pain every moment, with no hope of relief except through violence. This universal suffering created a kind of nihilism where nothing mattered, because everything hurt. Why care about honor or loyalty or the future when you're being tortured by your own nervous system? The only rational response to that situation is to embrace the violence that brings relief and stop caring about anything else. Blood Angels suffered individually and episodically. Not every brother struggled with the red thirst at the same intensity. Some found it relatively easy to resist, while others fought constant battles to maintain control. The Black Rage struck randomly, but most brothers never fell to it, dying in battle with their minds intact. This meant that suffering wasn't universal or constant. There were good days and bad days. There were brothers who could help those struggling because they weren't themselves in crisis at that moment. The curse was manageable in ways the nails never could be. The philosophical implications of these different approaches to rage are profound. The World Eaters represent the idea that we are what we feel, that if our brain chemistry or neural structures push us toward certain behaviors, we have no real choice but to follow. They're biological determinists in the most literal sense, slaves to the artificial modifications made to their brains. In their worldview, free will is an illusion. You are your worst impulses, and trying to resist them is both futile and pointless. The Blood Angels represent the opposite philosophy, that we are what we choose to be despite what we feel. Yes, the red thirst pushes them toward bloodlust and violence. Yes, the Black Rage might claim them at any moment. But until that moment comes, they choose to resist, choose to maintain their honor, choose to be more than mere expressions of genetic programming. In their worldview, free will is the only thing that matters. You are defined not by your impulses, but by whether you give in to them or rise above them. Warhammer 40,000 doesn't provide a clear answer about which philosophy is correct. The World Eaters have survived for 10,000 years despite their curse, though survived is perhaps too generous a word for their scattered, degraded state. The Blood Angels have thrived while maintaining their curse, though the constant struggle takes its toll, and the threat of the Black Rage hangs over every brother. Both approaches work in the sense that both forces continue to exist, but only one preserves what we might recognize as humanity, as meaning, as honor worth defending. The tragedy of the World Eaters is that they never had a real choice. Once Angron ordered the adoption of the Butcher's nails, once those implants were hammered into their skulls, their fate was largely sealed. They could have resisted, maybe, could have refused the implantation, but that would have meant defying their Primarch and possibly facing execution as a consequence. And even if they'd refused, Angron himself was already broken by the nails. The Legion would still have been led by a Primarch who hated the Emperor and sought only violence. They might have fallen to chaos through a different path, but they likely would have fallen regardless. The triumph of the Blood Angels is that they did have a choice, and they made the right one, over and over across 10,000 years. Every Blood Angel who resists the red durst when surrender would be easier makes that choice. Every chapter master who dedicates resources to searching for a cure instead of just managing symptoms makes that choice. Every chaplain who shepherds the Death Company with honor instead of treating them as disposable makes that choice. The Blood Angels are what they are because of millions of individual choices made by thousands of warriors across millennia, all choosing control over surrender, honor over ease, humanity over monstrosity. Conclusion: Two Faces of Rage. We've journeyed through the histories of two Space Marine legions that began in similar places and arrived at destinations as different as heaven and hell. The World Eaters and Blood Angels both carried curses that pushed them toward bloodlust and violence. Both were renowned shock assault troops. Both painted their armor in shades of red that spoke to the blood they spilled. Both struggled with the darkness within them every day of their existence. Yet one fell to chaos and became scattered warbands of Khorne worshippers who exist only to kill, while the other remained loyal and became one of the Imperium's most honored chapters, maintaining discipline and nobility despite their genetic flaws. The difference between these outcomes came down to leadership, culture, and the fundamental choice between controlling rage and surrendering to it. Angron never had a chance to be the Primarch the Emperor intended. The Butcher's nails robbed him of that potential before the Emperor ever found him. Every moment of his existence after those implants were driven into his skull was suffering, and the only escape he knew was violence. He couldn't build something better for his sons because he didn't know what better looked like. His entire frame of reference was slavery, gladiatorial combat, and the brief respite that came from killing. So he shared his curse with his legion, believing that shared suffering was the same as brotherhood, and he led them down a path that could only end in damnation. Sanguinius had every advantage Angron lacked. He was raised by people who loved him, never experienced slavery or torture, and developed a personality defined by nobility and compassion rather than rage and pain. When he discovered his legion carried a curse, his response was to search desperately for a cure while building support structures to help them resist. He led by example, showing his sons that honor and discipline could withstand any curse if you were willing to fight for them. He died trying to protect the Emperor and the Imperium, and that death created a new curse for his sons. But even that tragedy was transformed into something meaningful through the traditions of the Death Company. The Butcher's Nails and the Flaw of Sanguinius were both terrible afflictions, but they were fundamentally different in ways that mattered. The nails were irreversible, universal, and constantly degrading. They removed the capacity for choice by making everything except violence into unbearable pain. The flaw was manageable, episodic, and left room for resistance. The red thirst could be fought. The black rage was inevitable for some, but not all. Warriors could serve for centuries without falling to either, maintaining their humanity through discipline and culture. The cultures that developed around these curses determined the trajectories of both legions. World Eater's culture said that giving in was inevitable, that trying to maintain honor or discipline was pointless, that the only thing worth doing was killing as much as possible before death claimed you. Blood Angel's culture said that resisting the curse was the highest form of service, that maintaining humanity despite inhuman impulses was what separated them from monsters, that every moment of control was a victory worth celebrating. These different cultures created different outcomes. The World Eaters became predictable, one-dimensional, effective only as a blunt instrument to be pointed at problems and allowed to kill until the problem disappeared. They lost the ability to coordinate, to plan, to adapt. They became less than they had been, degrading with each passing century until they were barely recognizable as Space Marines. They serve Khorne now, but their service is indistinguishable from what they were doing before they formally swore to him. They were already lost. The oath just made it official. The Blood Angels became flexible, disciplined, capable of complex operations while maintaining their effectiveness in close combat. They preserved their culture across 10 millennia, maintaining the traditions of art and beauty that Sanguinius established to give them anchors against the red thirst. They honor their fallen through the Death Company, ensuring that even brothers lost to the Black Rage can die with dignity fighting for the Emperor. They're more than they might have been without their curse, defined by their struggle to rise above it rather than by the curse itself. The philosophical questions raised by these two legions are profound. Are we what we feel? Slaves to our biology and brain chemistry? Or are we what we choose? Capable of rising above our worst impulses through will and discipline? The World Eaters and Blood Angels represent opposite answers to this question, and Warhammer 40,000 is ambiguous enough not to declare one answer definitively correct. But there's a reason the Blood Angels are celebrated across the Imperium while the World Eaters are reviled as traitors. There's a reason players of the tabletop game and readers of the novels connect with the Blood Angels' struggle to maintain honor despite their curse, while viewing the World Eaters as cautionary tales about the dangers of surrendering to rage. We recognize in the Blood Angels something aspirational. The idea that we can be more than our worst impulses if we're willing to fight for it. We recognize in the World Eaters something tragic. The loss of potential and humanity that comes from surrendering to darkness. The story of these two legions is ultimately about the choices we make when faced with our own inner darkness. Everyone carries something, whether it's anger issues or addiction or mental illness or just the 10-job anyone. General human capacity for cruelty and selfishness. The question is, what we do with that darkness. Do we embrace it? Let it define us? Surrender to it because resisting is hard? Or do we fight it? Build structures and habits and relationships that help us resist. Choose every day to be better than our worst impulses push us to be. The World Eaters chose surrender. They had reasons. The Butcher's nails made resistance nearly impossible. Angron gave them no alternative model to follow. Chaos offered them relief and power in exchange for service. But ultimately, they chose to stop fighting, to let the rage consume them, to become weapons that kill without thought or purpose beyond the accumulation of skulls. They lost everything that made them more than savage killers, and they can never get it back. The Blood Angels chose resistance. They had reasons too. Sanguinius gave them a model of nobility to aspire to. Their culture provided tools to manage the curse. Hope that a cure might be found sustained them through the worst moments. But ultimately, they choose every day to keep fighting, to maintain their discipline, to be more than their curse. They pay a terrible price for this choice. Brothers fall to the black rage. The red thirst claims warriors who lose control. The constant struggle is exhausting, but they endure, and their endurance means something. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, these two legions represent the full spectrum of how warriors handle the violence that defines their existence. One becomes the violence, loses itself in bloodshed and rage, exists only to kill. The other channels the violence, controls it, uses it in service of something greater than mere destruction. Both survive. Both fight. But only one preserves what we might recognize as humanity worth defending. The Blood Angels are tragic heroes, cursed beings who maintain their honor through sheer force of will. The World Eaters are tragic villains, broken beings who surrendered to their curse and became monsters. Both tragedies emerged from similar origins, but leadership, culture, and choice made all the difference. Angron and Sanguinius, the Butcher's nails and the flaw, the path of surrender and the path of resistance. These parallel stories show us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when cursed by forces beyond our control, we still have agency. We can still choose what we become. The World Eaters are a warning about what we lose when we stop fighting our worst impulses. The Blood Angels are an inspiration about what we can preserve when we never stop fighting. Both lessons are valuable. Both deserve study and reflection. And both legions, in their own ways, reveal fundamental truths about rage, honor, and the balance between the two that defines what it means to be a warrior in the Imperium of Man. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the World Eaters and Blood Angels, into the parallel paths of two cursed legions, and what their divergent fates tell us about choice and character, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me create more content like this, exploring the rich lore of Warhammer 40,000 and the philosophical questions embedded in these stories of the far future. Let me know in the comments which legion or faction you'd like me to cover next, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, we are what we choose to be, not what we're cursed to become. Good night, and sleep well.